This is another topic where I'm just like, bro, what would make you do this? Similarly to the whole Mount Everest video. Once again, what would compel a person? All over the world, there are underwater cave systems, isolated and hauntingly beautiful spaces, winding and turning tunnels, hidden chambers, and small entryways. This is a world that to this day remains mostly uncharted just due to the dangers opposed to anyone wanting to undergo the task. This is the Makes Me Sick video about cave diving and deep diving. Sorry if my camera's shaking, I actually have the microphone plugged in this time in an effort to improve my audio quality, so my bad. Okay, cave diving is the act of diving into caves full of water. There are actually a lot of reasons why people do this for practicality, like research and things like that. People dive to explore caves for scientific research, as an extreme sport, and in more unfortunate cases for the rescue and recovery of lost people. Because of the extreme nature of cave diving, there is a bunch of equipment and techniques used to maximize safety on these dives. Now, diving in and of itself doesn't seem that scary to me. Like, I would dive at a reef or like go scuba diving, see some fish, but for me, I have to be able to see the surface. Either way, to me, regular diving, like seeing some fish in a reef and stuff like that, that seems cool to me. That seems like a cool activity that I probably would do. Everything about this changes once the dive is restricted to a cave. This is an environment that's difficult for even the most experienced cavers to explore. Before I dive into the cave itself, I want to look over the equipment that a lot of people use to accomplish these dives. So these people are actually carrying so much gear that I didn't even make the full list. They have air tanks, they're sucked into these wetsuits. They have to use masks and regulators and all sorts of other like little bits and bobs. Depending on the type of dive that this is going to be, the gear can range from 35 to 100 pounds. That's for cave diving, but for like regular scuba diving, 10 to 80 pounds is what I've read. This equipment is not only heavy as hell, it is expensive. For a beginner with no gear or training, on the scuba message boards that I looked over for the purpose of researching this video, people were saying that for literally a beginner with no gear, no training, it's probably going to be about $4,000 up front for the gear and the training. Luckily for divers, this weight is somewhat mitigated by the Archimedes principle. This is a law of physics pertaining to fluid mechanics. So what exactly makes cave diving so dangerous? Well, there are the obvious reasons. Like obviously the fact that we are land animals, we need air to survive. If something in a cave diving situation goes awry, you're not going to be able to just swim back up like a regular diving situation. So a huge portion of this danger is obviously owed to running out of air. But there is a common factor that leads to people running out of air in these underwater cave systems, which is getting lost inside of the cave. So like I said earlier, caves, especially those that are underwater, are some of the last uncharted places on the planet. Navigating these caves in the first place is extremely difficult. As mentioned earlier, tight spaces, twisting tunnels, there is a complete lack of natural light, and sediment gets kicked up with the movement of divers. With all of this combined, getting lost can happen in an instant. If headlamps fail, if too much sediment gets kicked up by divers, or if somebody just panics, it can spell disaster very quickly. Often divers will use a guideline to avoid becoming lost in these confusing underwater caves, but even these can't fully get rid of the hazard because they are extremely hard to find if you lose it underwater. If you lose track of the guideline, it's hard to spot it again, especially if other people have already been swimming and there's sediment clouding your vision. And they also pose their own hazard, as there's been cases of unlucky divers unfortunately becoming tangled up in this guideline. So in my research of cave diving as a whole, I came upon what I would call a repeat offender for fatalities associated with cave diving. This is a condition called nitrogen narcosis. So this is a condition when breathing compressed inert gases under the pressure of water. And it usually happens to people who choose to dive below 100 feet. People who have experienced this syndrome compare it most to alcohol intoxication. This affects the diver's judgment, reasoning, short-term memory, and their concentration. This particular ailment in a cave diving setting is almost always fatal. So there are probably thousands of cave diving stories out there that are horrific and crazy, but during my research, there was one that stuck out to me because it was particularly unique. This event is the Sterkfontein cave tragedy. Of course, getting lost in a cave and eventually succumbing to a watery grave is a terrifying fate. However, the prospect of getting lost and remaining lost for a long period of time inside of a cave seems so much worse to me. Sterkfontein caves are located about an hour outside of Johannesburg, South Africa. These caves are of great paleoanthropological interest, with lots of early hominid remnants being located inside of the cave system. In 1989, 29-year-old Peter Verhulsel will go on a caving expedition with two of his colleagues in the Sterkfontein cave system. These two colleagues were Nuno Gomes and Malcolm Keeping. This dive was actually Nuno Gomez's idea originally. This was actually supposed to be a very simple dive, with the three men diligently following the guideline to an air pocket without issue. There, they would briefly surface and ponder in awe at the prehistoric nature of the cave. The plan was simply to follow the guideline back out, and this should have been a very straightforward task. However, curiosity got the better of Peter. Lured by the mystique of these ancient cave systems, he veered off the guideline and into a nearby tunnel, just wanting to see what may lay ahead. When this happened, Nuno Gomes would grab him because he could see him only by his flashlight and guide him back before he got too turned around. They continued along, and as the men prepared to surface, they would have to exit through a tight squeeze where they would presumably have to pause for a moment and either remove their gear or rearrange their gear to be able to fit. This is the moment when the two men realized that Peter was not with them anymore. They had a quick look around, but continued to surface, hoping that Peter had surfaced somewhere else. Seeing as this cave was full of random twists, turns, and tunnels, so much so that the walls below the surface resembled Swiss cheese with holes just big enough for people to fit through. However, they soon realized that he had not taken another exit. Once they realized this, Nuno and Malcolm did get back in and follow the guideline in an attempt to figure out where Peter had gone. See, one of the issues with getting lost inside of a cave is that your orientation will be completely off. Like I said, and like you know, we are land animals. So the fact that you are swimming in an underwater system and the way that flashlights cast in a cave with many different twists and turns and caverns and whatnot, you are going to be disoriented. Nothing that you see is going to look familiar. This is why they do the guideline. You're not going to be able to just turn around and be like, oh, I recognize that rock. No. You're floating, so accidentally getting turned around could be relatively easy, and then you might be faced with 3 identical exits or entrances to somewhere else. You don't know because none of it looks familiar. Nuno and Malcolm searched on their own for over 4 hours, but this was a fruitless effort. Not only were they unable to ascertain which of these dozens of tunnels he could have went into, the activity of them searching for as long as they had only served to muddy the water and reduce their visibility significantly. Due to this cave's shallow nature, they were sure that Peter had to be in an air pocket somewhere near to the cave's entrance. Rescuers, Nuno, and his colleagues would search for another 24 hours, and by that time the visibility inside of the cave was pretty much zero, so the authorities called off the search for the time being, just for the safety of all the people attempting this recovery rescue mission. The mood was shifting the more time that passed, and eventually they were certain that this was going to be a body recovery mission. The truth is, Peter likely did attempt to retrace his steps to get to the guideline, but the silt that was kicked up and just the way that the cave is formed would have made it almost impossible for him to be able to spot it or know where it would be near to. At some point, Peter did in fact surface in an air bubble deep within the cave walls. It was a small room, but it was enough to at least sit on the shore of it and get out of the water. So, Peter was alive the entire time that they were searching for him, and once they were certain that they were searching for a body, he was living. Peter was left in this cave with only about 30 minutes of his flashlight left. He attempted to use this to signal to any rescuers where he was, but this did not work. Peter could have re-entered the water and attempted to find his own way back out, but it seems like he was certain that they would find him. He just wasn't that far away. Peter sat in darkness in this exact room for days, as they were certain that he had already drowned. And he had enough air to make it to the exit, he just didn't know the way. Rescuers barely searched in the weeks coming because they were sure that he was long gone. It's been weeks at this point. This would have been a maddening end. Trapped inside of a cave system with no light, no food, no idea how much time has passed because you have no light. This went on for weeks, and he would have eventually become too weak to move. What happens to the human mind under this type of isolation is really scary. Peter would eventually succumb to starvation within this cave, not far from the exit at all. Peter's body would eventually be discovered by dry cavers who tunneled in from a cave above that led down into the cavern where he was. He had scrawled his last words on the rock, which were, "I love you, Cheryl and Ma." Oof, okay. So, for the purpose of the deep diving side of this video, I decided to watch a documentary called Dave Not Coming Back. Completely candid right now, this was one of the most sad but also just tense, suspense filled. Even though you know what is going on just from the title, you understand that Dave is not coming back, but people were so passionate. They really believed in what they were doing, and it all just did not pan out. So I actually watched this documentary for free on a YouTube channel called Gravitas Beyond Limits. This is a story of David Shaw and what happened to him while he attempted to recover the body of Dion Dreyer in 2004. Dion Dreyer had passed away in Bushman's Hole 10 years before this rescue attempt or this recovery attempt. This documentary outlined this entire team's determination and eagerness to recover the body of Dion Dreyer, who was at the bottom of Bushman's Hole. He was 272 meters deep, or 869 feet below the surface. In the documentary, they retell the story of David discovering Dion's body in the first place while he was on a world record dive in Bushman's Hole. And since he had found it, he had it in his mind that he was going to recover this young man's body. For me, the imagery used through this film of the caves and the dark spaces and the narrow ways that they have to go through, these images were extremely psychologically distressing for me. The family and friends of Dave spoke of him with so much love and respect. In the beginning, when they first start planning this recovery mission, Dave and the other leader of the dive, Don, they stated very clearly that if something goes wrong and one of them isn't coming up for whatever reason, there should be no rescue missions to try to recover them, because that would show how dangerous it is to do this. This came from a place of the idea that one fatality is less awful than multiple over the same situation. They had a plan that involved several individuals working in synchronicity to retrieve Dion's body without incident. There would be a trail of divers along a guideline the entire length of the 265-meter dive. Dave was to be at the lowest spot, and he was going to be the one to actually put Dion's body in a secure carrier. Then he was supposed to swim up to a certain point with Dion's body and hand it on to the next diver along the line, and Dave would decompress at this spot. The divers would follow this path, each bringing the body up to the allotted next person and then waiting their decompression time at that spot before they could swim up to the surface. So they embarked on their journey to the bottom of Bushman's Hole, and all of this plan seemed to be going swimmingly. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until the other leader of the dive, Don, couldn't see any sort of bubbles or movement of Dave's flashlight at the bottom. He pretty much immediately abandoned the notion that nobody would go help Dave if he didn't rise, and he started trying to go down there. However, as he attempted to do this, his critical equipment began to crack under the pressure of the water, and there was nothing he could realistically do. Meanwhile, on the surface, the team eagerly awaits word of what's happening below the surface, and they would get that unfortunate news soon. Divers further up in the water began to give word that they were only seeing one flashlight. They didn't know if it was Don or Dave, they just knew that one of them was missing. Although Don was the one coming up, in his panic, he didn't do his decompression stops, and he had a serious case of the bends. And he almost lost consciousness under the water before by some miracle he found the guideline and was able to grab onto it before floating down into oblivion. Okay, quick side note so that I can explain exactly what decompression sickness is, or the bends. This is an illness caused by bubbles forming in a diver's blood and tissue as they rise up from the ocean if they do it too quickly. The bubbles are formed when dissolved nitrogen in a diver's blood begin to release too rapidly due to the rapid decrease in surrounding pressure. This is why it's imperative that divers stop along their ascent to assure that they aren't affected. Symptoms can include joint pain, fatigue, lower back pain, numbness or paralysis of the legs, and weakness and numbness in the arms. Other symptoms include dizziness, nausea, vomiting, difficulty urinating, confusion, visual or hearing problems, impaired balance, difficulty breathing, and loss of consciousness. Unfortunately, in this instant, Dave wasn't rising and Dion could not be recovered. And once again, the mood had shifted, where this had turned from a recovery mission for Dion Dreyer into a rescue mission for the surviving diver Don. This documentary covers this story far better than I ever could, and I strongly recommend you to watch it. It is really an incredible and tragic story. As the story went along, they would reveal that divers in the future would locate a line floating idly in Bushman's Hole and tug at it. Dave and Dion's bodies would begin to rise, tangled up in that guideline. The bodies of both Dion Dreyer and Dave Shaw would be recovered. Dave had a GoPro camera strapped to his head, and this recorded his final moments. This is truly harrowing footage, like truly terrible footage. Just watching it, I felt dizzy. There were so many times during this documentary where I wanted to just cut it off completely, just because of how anxiety-inducing it is. And at some points, I did take breaks, but I was determined to finish it, and I'm glad I did finish it. It was extremely eye-opening. It gave what I feel like was a 360 view of the diving experience and how it can go absolutely wrong so quickly, even for the most experienced divers. Makes me sick.